have a Prime Minister. The United Kingdom now has a new leader at the helm of the country, Sir Keir Starmer. As expected, Starmer has stormed his opponents. His party, the Labour Party, has won more than 410 of the 650 seats in the British Parliament. It has been a tsunami. It was the worst result for the Conservatives since the beginning of the 20th century. And you may be wondering, who on earth is Sir Keir Starmer? Who is this man who has swept the Conservatives off their perch? For many of you, this is probably the first time you have heard this name. However, for the British, he is far from an unknown. Starmer entered politics in 2015 and became leader of the opposition in 2020. But from the very beginning, he was already showing promise. First as a reputable activist campaign lawyer, later as a human rights advocate, and then as chief prosecutor for England and Wales between 2008 and 2013. In fact, his title of Sir did not just fall from the sky. Queen Elizabeth II herself awarded it to him in 2014 for his services to the country's judicial system. However, let us tell you, if there is one thing Starmer will be remembered for, it will be for ending the last Conservative cycle. After 14 years in power, the Tories, the Conservatives, are leaving. And they're leaving with a frankly embarrassing defeat. Well, those of you watching from the UK are probably thinking, well, this whole matter of parties passing the baton after long cycles of political control is not so unusual either. After all, if British politics has been characterised by anything, especially since the 1980s, it is by long cycles of single-coloured governments. First, we had a Conservative cycle with Thatcher and John Major, then a Labour one with Tony Blair and his successor Gordon Brown, and from 2010 until now, another Conservative cycle that has seen up to 5 different Prime Ministers. The British have recently set out to compete with the Italians in the unusual contest of the government's blender, and if you are loyal followers of VisualPolitik, you will already know, the last few years in the UK have not been easy, especially for the Conservative Party. Thatcher's Conservative stability is long gone. The last Conservative cycle has been characterised fundamentally by one thing: chaos. The Scottish independence referendum, the Brexit referendum, Brexit itself, the immigration crisis, the Johnson scandals, the Truss shake-up, and so on and so forth, have turned national politics upside down. And let me ask you a question. If you were British and you saw that the governing party was in constant crisis, wouldn't you want to see a change? Well, that's exactly what the British voted for. In fact, rather than for his own charisma or the freshness of his ideas, many analysts are clear. Sir Keir Starmer has won because the British people cannot stand the Conservatives anymore. Now, why? What have they done that the people have rejected them en masse? Does such a crushing defeat make sense? What could the UK look like under Starmer's new Labour cycle? Well, in this video, we're going to answer all these questions. So let's get started.
The source of all evils.
We would be lying to you if we told you that the 14 years of this Conservative cycle have been a disaster, because they haven't. In fact, the first 5 were relatively stable and had a fairly respectable government compared to those that have come after. We're talking, of course, about the David Cameron era. Cameron, who came to power in 2010 with a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, managed to cope quite well with the ravages of the great economic crisis that hit half the world after the fateful 2008. He managed to keep the economy from stagnating completely, reduce the public deficit by more than 40%, and managed to increase the employment rate by 5%, even in spite of the crisis. That is what largely explains why in 2015, the British gave him an overwhelming absolute majority. Cameron could finally rule alone. However, his victory came with a poisoned apple that he himself put on his plate. And yes, indeed, you guessed it, we're talking about Brexit. Alas, Brexit, the source of all ills for the Conservative Party. Good riddance, many will be thinking now. And it's for that reason, as you know, against all odds, on the 23rd of June 2016, this happened.
UK votes to leave EU after dramatic night divides nation.
That's when the debacle began. Nobody expected it. And the first to abandon ship? Do you know who it was? Exactly. David Cameron himself. Since then, the Conservatives have governed more due to the futility and overly radical profiles of their opponents than on their own merits. And remember that they even managed to win an election in 2019, improving on their results of 2017 and taking another piece of absolute majority at the hands of Boris Johnson. But then, how is it possible that everything went wrong in such a short time? Well, you see, there are several reasons, but obviously the parade of prime ministers in recent years is not something that happens for nothing. Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss the short-lived, and Rishi Sunak. All this in just 5 years. And you see, if we said before that Brexit has been the poisoned candy for the Tories, it is precisely for a reason. The Conservatives were so taken by surprise by the result of the referendum, which not many of them even supported, that what they came up with was to bet on a kind of soft Brexit. That is, not completely letting go of the European Union's hand, something like leaving in order to somehow stay. The problem is that this was not supported by all Conservatives, and in Brussels, they were very clear that they would not make it easy for the British to leave. Why? Simple. If the process was easy, several countries could follow in London's footsteps, so it was necessary to do exactly the opposite, to trip them up as a warning. The fact is that with the big mistake of Brexit, mistake because of the way it was proposed, not because of the idea itself, Great Britain was left for a long time in a kind of limbo for investment, international trade, and of course, businessmen and the British themselves began to get fed up, and rightly so. Although we are not going to go into much detail on this issue because, you know what? We already have several videos on this topic, and we'll leave you some links down in the description. The thing is that even once Brexit was finalised, after several delays and a lot of uncertainty, people started to reject it. And not only to reject it, more and more people have been regretting voting in favour of Brexit. Today, more than 60% of Britons think it was a mistake. But why? Well, very simple. What they were promised is simply not being delivered. And yes, for that, the Conservatives, and only the Conservatives, are responsible. This is perhaps the seed of almost all the country's problems. There was no plan. Brexit came with promises of relaunching the economy, recovering sovereignty, and being able to finalise their own trade agreements. However, although they can now make all their decisions, the reality is that the promises of prosperity have fallen on deaf ears. The government is being excruciatingly slow to turn things around, and that is when it has not given up on changing them altogether. The idea of wanting to be the Singapore of Europe has been forgotten, and not because they can't, but basically because they either don't want to or don't have a plan for achieving it.
New report reveals UK economy is almost £140 billion smaller because of Brexit.
Yes, the United Kingdom has already concluded more than 70 trade agreements with countries such as Australia and New Zealand, but none is large or expansive enough to replace the huge volume of free trade it had with the European Union. And not only that, Brexit has multiplied the bureaucratic and administrative obstacles to exports to continental Europe, which is the main trading partner of the British. To top it all off, the idea of eliminating regulations, lowering taxes, and, in short, making the economy more competitive has come to nothing. And all this, logically, has had direct effects on people's pockets. To give you an idea, several studies indicate that the increase in imported food prices directly attributable to Brexit is around 6%. And that is no small thing, even more so at a time when many prices have soared for many different reasons, including the energy shock of the breakup with Russia. Of course, as they no longer share the same food safety approvals, some products from the EU now require special certificates. This is the case, for example, for certain meat, fish, and dairy products, which now require official health certificates to enter the UK. Something that, as you can imagine, has a cost, because they have to be granted by veterinarians or phytosanitary experts. Of course, this could have been avoided by accepting a flexible framework. For example, by accepting products produced under European Union standards. But I've already told you that, as far as regulations are concerned, there has been little progress. And this is not all. From CER, the Centre for European Reform, they point out that today, investment in the country is 11% lower than it could have been in the absence of Brexit. In total, Brexit is estimated to have had a direct effect on the pockets of Britons of around £2,000 per year by 2023. That's £2,000 less each year per head. £8,000 for a family of 4 people, which is equivalent to more than $10,000 US. VisualPolitik community, they promised the world. The idea might not have been bad, but the execution has been terrible. And that, yes indeed, is the fault of the Tories. However, just a moment, the British have not only kicked the Conservatives for feeling cheated, The reality is that they have not managed the country's economy very well either, neither before nor after the pandemic, the inflation crisis, or the war in Ukraine. The British economy suffers from a major problem. It's not very productive. In fact, their productivity has grown very little over the last 2 decades. If you look at the trend, between the 1990s and the 2008 crisis, British productivity was increasing like a rocket. But since then, and throughout the Conservative leadership, which, remember, started in 2010, the evolution has been quite poor. Now, many of you may be wondering, but is all this productivity stuff, which sounds very economic and businesslike, really such an important indicator for ordinary people like you or me? Well, productivity is almost everything in economics. It's what ultimately determines whether a country is on the way to higher value added, higher wage jobs, or the opposite. In order to achieve high productivity, one of the things that must be achieved is high levels of private investment in the economy. For example, in capital goods or in machinery and technology capable of improving the efficiency of workers. Well, judging by the figures, the UK has a problem with this. Check it out. According to several economic studies, the United States produces 28% more value added per hour than the United Kingdom, and the French and Germans 13% and 14% more, respectively. And this was in 2019, before the COVID and Ukraine crises. Now, the data are worse. The British government, despite being in theory a right-wing government, has been setting excessive regulations against business and investment, as well as high and complex taxes, and excessive hiring and firing costs. All of these are things that don't exactly encourage companies to put more money on the line, so investment goes down. And do you know what happens when there is little investment? Exactly. The economy starts to get trapped in a vicious circle of low skills, low wages, and low productivity. It's therefore not surprising that the United Kingdom has stagnated. Between 2007 and 2022, its GDP grew by only 7%, compared to other countries such as Australia or the United States, which grew by more than 15%. And of course, with a stagnant economy, what do you think happens to household incomes? Well, they also stagnate. In fact, although they have not fallen, the reality is that they have fallen behind those of France and Germany, which they used to surpass. And obviously, that is an absolute failure. The Tory economic model simply does not work. And if all this were not enough, the Conservatives' reputation on economic matters was absolutely sunk, particularly by one person, former Prime Minister Liz Truss. Truss saw all these problems and wanted to find a solution. The problem is that she did it at the wrong time, with terrible communication and without support. And to top it off, she wanted to perform a complicated pirouette, deregulate the economy, lower taxes, and at the same time boost public spending. Her plan gambled everything on achieving results that were as quick as they were uncertain. It was a bit like going all in on zero at roulette. On paper, the plan made some sense, but with the situation the country was in and the way the plan was formulated and communicated, the result was a colossal disaster. The plan barely lasted hours after unleashing financial chaos, including the collapse of the pound. It was not for nothing that we gave her one of our famous anti-awards. But wait a minute, because in addition to all this, there is another problem that typically haunts all governments: political scandals. VisualPolitik community, Conservatives have not been exempt from scandals either. What's more, we would almost say that if they were baseball cards, they've collected so many that they have a good assortment of doubles to give away. But do you want to meet the father of all scandals? Well, take a look.
Boris Johnson admits attending Downing Street party during lockdown.
This was the final straw. While the government was ordering people to stay indoors or suffer severe restrictions because of the pandemic, Prime Minister Boris Johnson and many of his team were having a blast partying at 10 Downing Street. You've got to have some nerve. This was so outrageous that all of Johnson's efforts during the pandemic were completely forgotten. All there was left was anger and rage. And what can I say? It's no wonder. So you see, whichever way you look at it, since Theresa May took over in 2016, the Conservatives have gone from bad to worse. No management, no results, no reputation. After the exit of Liz Truss, the popularity of the Tories sank to the subsoil. And right there is when the Conservatives tried to play their last card, their final hope, betting on the guy they thought could bring some stability to the government and would at least eventually make many Brits leave their anger behind. We are, of course, talking about Rishi Sunak. Now, and what more can I say? It's true that Sunak has had his work cut out for him to take over a drifting government from an aimless party, but his government has relied on blind sticks to try to please the voter base that chose Brexit 8 years ago. For example, by putting the issues of immigration and crime at the top of the agenda. We are not going to tell you much about Sunak either, because we also have a video that will link for you here in the description, but if we had to describe him in a few words, it would be something like a right-wing populist, the last standing result of the conservative meltdown. Not to mention the surreal moments he has been leaving for shorts, reels, and TikToks. Do you remember when he asked a homeless person if he was in the business world?
Well, do you work in business? Do you want some
No,
fruit?
I'm homeless.
Or when he said that his childhood had been precarious because he didn't have cable TV.
But there'll be all sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
Or that one about the Coke.
Yeah, I'm a Coke addict. Total Coke addict. Coca-Cola addict.
Anyway, if we started, we won't stop. Rishi in his pure state. It's true that, at the very least, Sunak has stabilised public debt below 100%, managed to tame inflation, and maintained unwavering support for Ukraine. But his outbursts and rudeness, even internationally, are not understood, either at home or abroad. He even went so far as to stand up World War II veterans on D-Day, which, as you can imagine, is unprecedented.
Furious veterans say Rishi Sunak's apology for skipping D-Day event doesn't scratch the surface.
He is, to say the least, too peculiar a guy to connect with the people, and his popularity at 19% is the worst for a Prime Minister since 1974. That's why, in this last election, the British people went to the polls ready to vote for a total change of course. It was a kind of, please, enough is enough. But what path now awaits them with the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer? Well, let's find out.
The Starmer era.
Four are the elections that Labour has lost consecutively in these last 14 Conservative years. You can imagine the despair they must have felt within the party. None of their candidates managed to be convincing, even though they tried almost everything. First, with Edward Miliband, a somewhat more technical and moderate profile, and one who sought to balance progressive policies with fiscal responsibility. It did not go so well. Then came Jeremy Corbyn, a more radical and flamboyant left-wing profile, with plans for huge public spending, and also for many, a traitor to the country for wanting to eliminate nuclear weapons. This did not go so well either, but now they've finally done it. After 4 years as leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer has become Prime Minister. Well, as you can imagine with everything we've told you previously, people's wariness with Conservatives have played a key role. But to stop there would be to not tell you everything. You see, Starmer brought Labour back to the centre-left after the disastrous Corbyn era, and many people who were afraid of an overly left-wing Labour Party were left hanging. Many believe that Starmer has won by giving himself a certain air of one of the most important political figures in the country's history, former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair. And we're talking about very similar profiles. His casual style, his hopeful way of speaking, his presence, all of that may have played an important role. But what if I told you that Starmer doesn't just look like Blair? What if I told you that he even looks like the Conservatives? And I know what you're thinking, yet another disappointment for the poor Brits. Let's see, not so fast. True, Starmer shares many positions with the now former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, but these are mostly limited to foreign policy. For example, both believe in Israel's right to defend itself, but also in a ceasefire and the two-state solution. Both see the United States as their preferred partner, and China as a potential threat with which to engage with great caution. And of course, both have positioned themselves in favour of Ukraine in the face of Russia's aggression. What's more, even without being Prime Minister yet, a little more than a year ago, Starmer left us this news.
Keir Starmer visits Kyiv to emphasize Labour's backing for Ukraine.
But we all know that foreign policy is a very special matter. Generally, in serious countries, whatever the government, positions do not usually take big swings. However, in national politics, things are different. There is something for everyone in Starmer's plans. However, at least his plan seems clear, and this is in stark contrast to the Conservative lurches of recent years. Although Starmer is Labour, his economic policy looks set to be a far cry from the fiscal mess proposed by his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. The new Prime Minister has made it clear there must first and foremost be fiscal balance. Starmer is aware of the scars left by the brief tenure of former Prime Minister Liz Truss, so it's no wonder he seeks to distance himself from anything that resembles her. However, it's not as if Starmer has abandoned the Labour pillars either. Starmer believes that the state must invest more and move away from austerity. For him, this is the way to achieve one of his main goals: to fight low productivity and make the UK the fastest growing G7 economy by 2030. In the end, I don't know if the state alone will be able to increase productivity. What is not clear is how it will manage to spend more and achieve fiscal balance in a limping economy already suffering from the highest taxes in many decades. To give you an idea, he has promised investments of billions of pounds for the improvement of ports, the construction of automobile megafactories, and the strengthening of the steel industry, among others. On top of that, Starmer also aims to transform the country's energy to become zero carbon by 2050. To achieve this, another of his star measures is the creation of a state investment body called Great British Energy, which will be endowed with some £8.3 billion. And all this in the hope of boosting renewable energies, creating up to 650,000 jobs, and reducing household electricity bills. Now, many of you may be thinking, oops, I see a lot of expenses here, but where is he going to get the money from? Well, Starmer does not seem foolish. The winner of this election knows that private investment is more than necessary, especially to end the country's economic stagnation. Therefore, he's promised not to punish it, at least not too much. For example, by maintaining the current 25% corporate tax rate. Obviously, he is not Javier Milei, nor is his only concern the economy. In fact, one of Starmer's main political trump cards in this campaign has been the problem the country is going through with the NHS, the public health system.
England's hospital waiting list rise to 7.57 million.
The national health system is at the limit. Waiting lists have not stopped growing since the COVID-19 pandemic and have already become a national emergency, with more than 7.5 million patients waiting to be seen. And this is only in England, not counting Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. It's a disaster. Well, to try to address this, Starmer has promised to create 40,000 new hospital appointments per week. That's 2 million new visits, so he's going to have to hire a lot of people. And perhaps, more importantly, reduce the number of patients who don't need to be hospitalised. And pay attention, because this could be one of the most serious problems of the British healthcare system. The inefficiency of the system is tremendous. Every year there are hundreds of thousands of cancelled appointments that are then left abandoned, and with no possibility of being used by other people. And not only that, the percentage of people who go to hospitals but really should only go to primary care is too high. And you will say, here we go again with people who don't know that there are clinics and go to the emergency room for everything. Well, even more so if we take into account that the British system is, how shall we say it, a bit odd. Its model is very focused on inpatient treatment and much less than others on routine monitoring and disease prevention in health centres. What's more, hospitals are also not making much effort to remove patients who no longer need to be there and make room for others. Can you imagine why? Well, because there is an incentive system whereby hospitals receive more funding the more patients they have. So if all the beds are occupied, the more money the hospital will receive. And all this, coupled with other problems such as GP congestion, it is no wonder that satisfaction with the healthcare system has fallen to an abysmal 24%. Of course, there is another challenge that we could not end this video without talking about, and one that has been the cornerstone of the Sunak government. We're talking, of course, about illegal immigration. And the fact is that, as if it were the Mediterranean, more and more boats loaded with illegal immigrants are arriving across the English Channel. In fact, this has already become one of the biggest concerns for the British. We're talking about tens of thousands of people who have collapsed the country's immigration system, which is simply not prepared for these volumes. Sunak attempted to reduce these arrivals with his controversial Rwanda Act, whereby thousands of people seeking asylum in the UK would be transferred to Rwanda in exchange for more than £750 million for the African country. However, although the number of undocumented boat arrivals was reduced from 46,000 in 2022 to 29,000 in 2023, hundreds of thousands remain in hotels at taxpayer expense, with no change of destination in sight. Against this backdrop, Starmer has proposed a more direct attack on this type of immigration. First, he wants a border security command, staffed with hundreds of investigators and police officers to attack the human smuggling mafias. And second, he intends to hire 1,000 additional staff members who will be responsible for more quickly assessing asylum cases, and if necessary, returning those who do not qualify. We are talking about a leader who seems to come with ambitious spending and procurement plans. But what about all the money he plans to invest from the government to achieve them? Where will the cash come from? From taxes? Let me stress that this is the question. For now, Starmer has already said that he will not raise VAT, income tax, corporate tax, or social security contributions for the most vulnerable and the middle class. So, what's left? Well, by judging what he will not touch, it seems that everything will come out of trying to fleece the country's richest people. And this raises a question for the future. Will Starmer stop the UK being such a sought-after destination for the highest earners halfway around the world? Will we see the rich packing their bags and heading elsewhere? Undoubtedly, Starmer's new mandate leaves many questions that we will be answering. For the moment, what is clear is that he has succeeded in ending the 14-year Conservative cycle. The British people wanted change after unfulfilled promises, economic mismanagement, and scandals from Conservative leaders, and they got it. Now it's the turn of the new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, to not disappoint them again. But for now, the question is for you. Do you think the huge punishment of the Conservatives at the polls is justified? Will Starmer succeed in straightening out the economy? Will he succeed in becoming the face of social democracy? Well, for now, leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And very important, if you liked this video, please like it and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so you won't miss any news. As always, thank you so very much for watching. All the best, see you next time.